G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy and the round 22 edition of Just the Tips. It's getting very, very warm at the moment. Not in a literal sense, since I've moved to Melbourne, it's been very chilly. But in terms of the finals race, absolutely, lots to play out. It's a very exciting part of the season. So, last week, it more or less sort of went to plan. I got 8 out of 9 correct tips, with the one I got incorrect was the one we live streamed on Saturday night with Brisbane beating Collingwood. So 8 out of 9 is not too bad. Funnily enough, in our competition, 78 people got a correct 9 tips out of, about 1,500 people. So I suppose for many, many people, it was an easy round to tip. So we'll get into round 22 very shortly. Before we do so, I have noticed that more than 52% of the audience over the last 28 days has actually been watching the content, but hasn't subscribed. So if you're one of those people who has been enjoying the content, it would mean a lot to us if you did help by subscribing to help grow this channel. So as we always do, we will shout out the weekly winners of our True Footy competitions. We have the tipping winner this week is somebody called Bullfrog. So I said that 78 people had gotten 9 correct tips. Well, the margin of 58 by Bullfrogs, who I presume is a Bulldogs fan, that was still the best margin anyone got this round. That's how unexpectedly one-sided that Thursday night clash was between the Bulldogs and the Giants. And that's coming from a Doggies fan. 88 points, that was enormous. The tipping leader is still Connor D, 26, with 138 and a margin of 412. Well done, Connor D. I reckon that's about a month now running as the tipping leader. And we do have a new fantasy leader for the first time, I reckon, this year, at least since the early rounds. Jaden Griffin has been pipped, and we now have Thomas Watson with an average of 2081 at the top of our competition. So well done, Thomas. That's outstanding work. All right, it's time to get into round 22. And it starts off with a particularly tough one to tip between Hawthorn and Collingwood at the MCG on Thursday night. Now, I think, a couple of weeks ago, I would have still tipped Collingwood, but the last few weeks have certainly given me some pause there. So starting with Hawthorn, I thought they were quite impressive against the Adelaide Crows. They did better, or at least got closer to winning that game than I expected. It was an interesting topsy-turvy kind of game with teams trading momentum blows. I suppose what works against Hawthorn is the fact that Will Day has now sustained, I think, the 3rd injury he's had on the same foot, if I'm not mistaken, and he's out for the season. And he is a big dynamic game changer for them. So that does come into my thinking here. However, as a team, I thought Hawthorn played quite well. Will Day was also playing well that night. Collingwood are on a slippery slope at the moment, dropping 3 of their last 4, one of them against the Gold Coast, then at home against Freemantle, and then being pretty much outmuscled by the Brisbane Lions, who were more or less always in control of the game, even if it wasn't one-sided in the end, really, 27 points. So they're looking a little bit vulnerable, and while there is some decent recent form here for Hawthorn against Collingwood specifically, like over the last few years when Hawthorn were kind of struggling, they still had a pretty good record against Collingwood with a couple of upsets in there. But their most recent clash earlier this year was a 10-goal win to Collingwood, which was very impressive. So I'm a little bit of a mess with this one. I actually don't know who to tip. I've changed my mind a number of times. I would actually go as far as to say Hawthorn is in the better form at the moment, minus Will Day, and I'm also anticipating Collingwood, they're not going to keep losing in perpetuity, so really tough one. I think I'm going to go Collingwood here, but I feel like this might burn me. I feel like I might rue this come Thursday night, but we'll see. I'm going to say Collingwood win this by 11 points, perhaps just the fact that they played so well against Hawthorn the first time, and I know they've got a couple of outs, etc., but so do Hawthorn with Will Day. So I'm going to say 11 points to Collingwood. Geelong versus Essendon at GMHBA Park. This one, I can't imagine not being a bit of a bloodbath, with all due respect to Essendon. I thought last week against the Sydney Swans, in tough conditions, that they kept that game to about 3 goals, or whatever it was in the end. So that in itself is something to be pleased about, considering the adversity they're experiencing right now as a footy club. They're kind of limping towards the end of the season, albeit, like I said, they played fairly well last week, with perhaps the weather a little bit of a level there, but still. I just think the Cats are a little bit of a different beast, and they are a team that tortures teams, and I feel like there's recent history with Geelong also torching Essendon in particular. So the recipe is there for a bit of a bloodbath at GMHBA, to be honest with you. And Geelong just dished one out of their own against Port Adelaide last week, in a game where we didn't learn much. We know Geelong's good, so they should be far too good in this case too. I'm going to say 67 points. Let's go big this week. The Brisbane Lions then host the Sydney Swans, and I'm sure when the AFL fixtured this for late in the season originally, there would be some sort of anticipation around the grand final rematch. You think, a game in August between these two sides, it will certainly shape the finals. And I suppose any game really can shape the finals from this point, but this game for a grand final rematch has very little anticipation for it for the neutral, I would have thought, to be honest. Other than the fact that both are still good teams. I mean, the Brisbane Lions are coming off a really strong performance against the Collingwood Footy Club at the MCG. We live streamed that game, as I said. So Logan Morris was fantastic. That was a very complete team performance, and they restricted Collingwood to just 67 points. So they're in pretty good form, despite the fact they got slaughtered the week before to the Gold Coast Suns. I really feel like the Lions are this team that rises to the occasion at the moment. And Sydney have been struggling this year. I do think they have been better in recent times, albeit probably still not at their best. If you look at, on paper, the 3-goal win against Essendon, well, it's not compelling form of them by itself. But I also get the impression that Sydney's not one of these teams to check out just because they can't play finals. I get the impression they're going to play hard, and therefore this is not an absolute gimme for the Brisbane Lions. I do think the Lions should win this at the Gabba in particular. And again, there's genuine stakes here for Brisbane in particular. Like, they can still lose the top 2 spot. As you can see on the live ladder there, they'd be 4th with Freemantle breathing down their necks, interestingly as well. So I'm going to say Brisbane win this, but it's probably not too one-sided, but we'll go 22 points, I reckon. Let's go 21, because that's where my mouse landed. Carlton and the Gold Coast Suns. Now, Carlton almost pulled off a massive upset last week with the performance in Perth, where they got 4 goals in front at halftime against Fremantle, and then for the 6th time this year conceded a loss from a winning position at halftime. So I think the record I read is 8 times in a season, Essendon, and I want to say it was 1998 off the top of my head, correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, there's 3 games left, and Carlton are still a mathematical chance to break that record. So I suppose you could say that's growth. I do think they also kind of play well against Fremantle, or at least that's what the history says. Like, that's an annoying game for Fremantle. This was once again an annoying challenge for them. So from that point of view, it was kind of promising from Carlton, but once again, the second half fade out, reared its ugly head. So the Gold Coast Suns, they're in a position to maybe, I don't know, without doing all the math, I think they can make top 4. I do think Brisbane winning last week against Collingwood kind of hurt that. They kind of need one of those top 4 teams to falter. Nonetheless, they're still playing, for a home final, so absolutely in the thick of it. They just have to overcome this Marvel Stadium sort of form that they have. And I just can't imagine, with all due respect to Carlton, them being the better side for long enough in this game. They could get the jump and make it awkward for them, but the Gold Coast Suns, even though it's at Marvel Stadium, I'm not brave enough to tip against them. Even if Carlton gets a lead, it's getting to the point where we can't expect them to hold it. I'm going to say that the Gold Coast Suns win this by 31 points. Port Adelaide versus Fremantle at Adelaide Oval. This is another tricky one for Fremantle. Probably the second week in a row they've played against a team that historically, or at least in terms of recent history, they don't necessarily play well against. So that was Carlton last week. A good win. Sometimes good teams win ugly, and I don't think it was Fremantle's best performance, but they've kind of been like that this year. They've probably had some of their most unconvincing games and then still won. So I'm talking North Melbourne by a goal, St Kilda by like 2 or 3 goals at Optus Stadium, then of course this one, and that's not even over a long period of time there. What does work for them well is that they play well against the best teams. So this is also challenging for Fremantle. I had to look up when the last time they beat Port Adelaide Oval was, because I felt like that's not a ground that they travel well to and play Port Adelaide at. As far as I can tell, they've never beaten Port Adelaide at Adelaide Oval. So they had wins at Amy Stadium, but that's how long ago it was that Port Adelaide lost to Fremantle in Adelaide. So there's a little bit of a scene set there. I mean, Fremantle, I suppose if you look at last year, they sort of faltered at the end of the season and sort of, tripped up when they really should have played finals. I think as it stands, they can lose this game and still make the finals, but Port Adelaide was the team that knocked them out of finals last year. Haven't said anything about Port Adelaide. They got slapped around by Geelong, and they're kind of limping towards the back end of this season as well. So with that all being said, I think that Fremantle still win this game, but I think it might be one of those ugly slog games where Fremantle really have to dig deep and win a game that they're kind of expected to win, but it's tougher than it should be. I'm going to say Fremantle win this game. Let's go 8, or let's go 11. Not that that's much different. GWS versus North Melbourne is actually the feature game we're going to be doing on the live show this weekend, Footy from the Flat. So if anyone's free and available, come and watch the game with us. So the Giants and North Melbourne is a bit of a mismatch. We generally pick games that we think are going to be close, although we've had some bad luck with this. So maybe we'll buck the trend the other way, and this will be closer than we expect. But the Giants were really poor on Thursday night against the Bulldogs. I do think that the Giants, the gap between their best and worst is too high or too far at the moment for a team that's, ideally going to be, at least from their perspective, trying to win the premiership this year. I mean, they'd have to do it from like 6th, 7th or 8th, but in the past, they've made a grand final doing that and then got close again in 23. So all that being said, it's just been a really frustrating season for the Giants, who can be, on their day, one of the more damaging teams in the comp, and they had an off day against one of the other more potent teams in the competition. North Melbourne battled it out with St Kilda, who frankly at the moment are just better. I think that has to be said. I mean, there's a lot of star talent in that St Kilda side, and they're not a great team, but they're more advanced than North Melbourne. And yet, for a while there, it did look like North were going to win that game. Bit of pressure on North Melbourne, I think, which is, an interesting point to say about a club that was expected to finish bottom 2 and may still get there. I think they play Richmond next week, but I think the fans are a little bit fed up, perhaps, with, the big losses, and they sustained one 2 weeks ago against Geelong. So there's still a bit to prove. I guess what I'm saying is they don't want to get belted in this game. I know that nobody does, but I think there will be some pressure on that. I might tip maybe 41 points, and not an absolute slaughtering, but North are kind of the sort of team that GWS would punish. They've done it to the weaker teams. Well, they did it to West Coast twice, so maybe it's just West Coast. Either way, I'm going to still tip 41 points to the Giants. Hoping it's closer than that. Melbourne and the Western Bulldogs, the 2021 Grand Final rematch at the MCG. Melbourne last week slaughtered West Coast. Again, I'm going to say it again. That doesn't really mean much for proving a team's worth at the moment. I think that was kind of expected because there's still some star talent in that Melbourne team. They're not a great side at the moment, but at the same time, they have got talent and can punish teams, and West Coast are very much the sort of team that get punished regularly. So I suppose it's a morale boost after a tough week the week before, with the loss against St Kilda. So they come up against the Bulldogs, who are obviously vying for finals, who are in 9th on the live ladder as it currently stands, and they have a chance to jump into the 8 this week, considering I've tipped Collingwood to beat Hawthorn. That could obviously be wrong. I think it would take Melbourne's best performance of the year off the top of my head to really challenge the Bulldogs here. The Bulldogs were very, very dominant against GWS and have so many weapons, particularly forward of centre, who can put scores on the board. And I'm not sure if Melbourne's defence at the moment can cope with the Western Bulldogs, in particular Sam Darcy, but not just Sam Darcy. I think this will be a good 38-point win for the Western Bulldogs, to be honest. Nothing against Melbourne. I would actually really be disappointed to see the Dogs drop this, because it would probably cost them finals whichever way you slice it. So I'll say the Dogs win this by 38. I almost forgot about this game. It's not for the first time I've done Adjust the Tips and then remembered there's an Eagles game coming up. Is there really too much to say about this game? West Coast were very convincingly beaten by Melbourne. Again, I did see it coming. I think Melbourne is talented, despite their inconsistency this year. I knew that we were ripe for a spanking, as it were. And that is only more true this week against the Adelaide Crows, who have, I think, the best percentage in the league. Yep, 144.1%, and some of the best forwards in the competition as well. And as a mix, they're very dominant, but they're a good team across the field. So the only thing that comes into the margin here is how hard are Adelaide willing to try. I don't think that they're going to slack off, to be honest. I think this is going to be an absolute belting. West Coast, to say something positive about them, I thought there were some good young players in that game that had their best performance of the year. But Adelaide also overcame a very spirited Hawthorn side twice in that same game, and I think they're full of momentum at the moment, and that does not bode well for the West Coast Eagles. I'm going to say this is 91 points. Hopefully Adelaide just start coasting at some point. It doesn't quite get to 100 points. So that is the conclusion of round 22 as I see it. The one I'm most iffy about is Hawthorn and Collingwood, and that could actually be the one that really influences the makeup of the top 8. I suppose the upset of the round could put Adelaide beat Freemantle. I think they could just because of the history between those two sides, and I think Freemantle might be a little bit vulnerable against a team that they tend to struggle against, and then we saw that again with Carlton. So it's not that Fremantle's not a lot better than them. They are at the moment, and I still think they'll win. That's probably my upset of the round, and the game of the round would be Hawthorn and Collingwood, personally. I suppose when you look at the ladder there, what are the big changes? I mean, Collingwood's back into the top 2, so that's a huge game for them. Fremantle in 5th, so they're really looking down the barrel of, potentially top 4 if somebody slips up, but also home final as well. The Gold Coast Suns still in a home final position, and the Bulldogs leapfrog Hawthorn. So this game is huge for Hawthorn's season. They do need to beat one of the Brisbane Lions or Collingwood to make the finals. If they lose them both, unless other things happen unexpectedly, they will likely miss. So that's the way I see it this week, guys. But as I said, I'm really iffy about that Hawthorn-Collingwood game. Let me know in the comments what you think, your upset of the round, your game of the round as usual, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.